I do think those relationships are deep and wide. I don't think we're going to go back to where we have been in the past with the United States. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think in large part, both of our countries took each other for granted. I don't think that's the case anymore.
The jobs of workers in our industries most affected by the U.S. tariffs in autos, in steel, and lumber. Our relationship with the United States will never again be the same as it was.
Breaking tonight. A Canadian ambassador has finally said out loud what many people quietly felt for years. The damage between the United States and Canada did not just happen. It was pushed. It was forced. And it changed the relationship forever. This is not coming from social media. This is not coming from political rivals. This is coming from the person who stood inside the room, who watched the talks collapse, and who saw trust break in real time. According to Canada's outgoing ambassador, the Trump years were the moment Canada realized something shocking, that its closest ally could suddenly become its biggest source of uncertainty. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada was simple and predictable. Two neighbors, two partners, two countries that trusted each other almost automatically. Trade flowed without fear. Security cooperation was quiet and strong. Borders felt firm but friendly. It was one of the most stable relationships in the modern world. People on both sides believed it would always be that way. No drama, no surprises, no serious doubts. But that sense of safety did not survive the Trump era. According to Canada's outgoing ambassador, what changed was not just policy. What changed was the mindset in Washington. The rules that had guided the relationship for generations suddenly no longer mattered. Stability was no longer valued. Predictability was no longer respected. Instead, pressure became the tool. Uncertainty became the strategy. And Canada, for the first time in modern history, was treated not as a trusted partner, but as leverage. The ambassador explains that this shift did not happen slowly. It happened fast. Decisions that once moved through institutions, advisors, and long discussions became centered around one person. Trade policy, diplomatic tone, and economic threats could change overnight. One statement, one tweet, one announcement. Canada was no longer responding to a system. It was reacting to impulses. This created a dangerous imbalance. Canada had built its entire strategy on the idea that the United States was steady, that even when leaders changed, the foundation stayed solid. But during the Trump years, that assumption collapsed. Tariffs were announced suddenly, threats were made publicly, long-standing agreements were questioned openly. Even Canada's sovereignty was joked about in ways that were never normal before. And these were not accidents. The ambassador makes it clear that pressure was intentional. The goal was not cooperation. The goal was control. By keeping allies unsettled, leverage increased. By creating fear, concessions became easier. This approach was not limited to Canada, but Canada felt it deeply because of how closely tied the two economies are. Steel and aluminum tariffs became the most visible example. Canada, one of America's most reliable suppliers and closest security partners, was suddenly labeled a national security risk. To Canadians, this was not just confusing. It was insulting. To businesses, it was devastating. Integrated industries were disrupted overnight. Costs jumped. Planning became impossible. The ambassador describes how Canada was forced into a new reality. Instead of negotiating calmly, it had to defend itself constantly. Instead of building long-term plans, it had to prepare for sudden shocks. Every announcement from Washington carried risk. Every silence carried uncertainty. This was not how allies behaved. What hurt most, according to the ambassador, was not the tariffs themselves. It was the message behind them. The message was simple and brutal. Respect was conditional. Cooperation could be withdrawn at any moment. Friendship did not guarantee fairness. And that realization changed everything. When the ambassador says both countries took each other for granted, she is not spreading blame evenly. She is explaining how one side relied on trust while the other exploited it. Canada assumed the relationship was too important to be used as a weapon. The Trump administration proved otherwise. This forced Canada to make a hard decision. It could either accept permanent vulnerability or it could change. Canada chose to change. Behind the scenes, Canada began reducing its exposure. It invested more in domestic strength. It looked beyond North America for trade opportunities. It prepared for volatility instead of stability, not because it wanted distance from the United States, but because it no longer felt safe depending on it completely. This was not anger. It was survival. At the same time, American businesses began feeling the consequences of this strategy. Corporate leaders understood immediately what was happening. They warned policymakers that supply chains were deeply connected, that tariffs would raise costs at home, that uncertainty would slow investment, that consumers would pay the price. Those warnings were ignored. As tariffs took effect, American companies absorbed the shock. Production costs rose. Export competitiveness dropped. Prices increased. Jobs came under pressure. The pressure campaign aimed at Canada ended up hurting American industry first. Canada adjusted. The United States paid. The ambassador explains that this period exposed a misunderstanding in Washington. The assumption was that Canada had no real choice, that geography would force compliance, that economic integration would prevent resistance. But instead of bending, Canada hardened its position. Predictability had been turned into vulnerability. And Canada learned from it. Perhaps the most powerful part of the ambassador's message is this: she does not believe the relationship will ever return to what it once was. And she does not say this with bitterness. She says it with clarity. The illusion is gone. Automatic trust is gone. Blind reliance is gone. What remains is something more cautious, more mature, more realistic.